When a patient cannot lie prone and hip extension is expected to be above grade 2, use the supine hip extension test. The patient lies supine with their heels off the table and arms folded across their trunk. The therapist cups both hands under the heel. The patient presses the limb downward toward the table, attempting to maintain full extension as the therapist raises the limb 24 to 36 inches from the table. The opposite limb almost always rises involuntarily. This should not be considered an aberrant test. Grades are assigned based on the patient's ability to maintain full extension as well as the resistance felt by the examiner.
Don't let me lift your leg from the table. Keep your hip locked tight and your whole body rigid as a board. Relax.
The gravity-resisted test for hip abduction is conducted with the patient side-lying with the test limb uppermost. The limb should be slightly extended beyond midline with the pelvis rotated slightly forward. The patient abducts their hip through the complete available range without flexing or rotating it in either direction. Resistance is given in a straight downward direction at either the knee or at the ankle if a longer lever arm is desired.
Lift your leg up in the air. Hold it. Don't let me push it down. And relax.
The gravity minimized test for hip abduction is performed supine. The therapist supports the test limb just enough to decrease friction. This hand offers no resistance, nor should it be used to offer assistance to the movement. The patient abducts the hip through the available range, while the therapist palpates the gluteus medius, just proximal to the greater trochanter.
Bring your leg out to the side. Keep your kneecap pointing to the ceiling. And relax.
The gravity-resisted test for tensor fasciae latae begins in side lying. The test limb should be uppermost and flexed to 45 degrees. The patient abducts the hip through approximately 30 degrees of motion. Downward resistance is given just proximal to the knee, while the other hand stabilizes the pelvis.
Lift your leg and hold it. Don't let me push it down. And relax.
The gravity minimized test for tensor fasciae latae begins in long sitting. The therapist supports the test limb under the ankle to reduce friction as the patient moves. The patient abducts their hip through 30 degrees of range or whatever is possible. The therapist palpates tensor fasciae latae on the proximal anterolateral thigh, where it inserts into the iliotibial band, or at the insertion into the lateral aspect of the knee.
Bring your leg out to the side. and relax.
The gravity-resisted test for hip adduction begins in side lying with the test limb lowermost. The upper limb is abducted approximately 25 degrees and supported by the therapist. The patient adducts their lower hip until the limb contacts the upper one. Downward resistance is applied on the medial surface of the thigh, just proximal to the knee.
Lift your bottom leg up towards your top leg. Hold it. Don't let me push it down. And relax.
The gravity-minimized test for hip adduction is performed supine, with the non-test limb positioned in some abduction to prevent interference with the motion of the test limb. The therapist slightly elevates the test limb from the table to decrease friction as the limb moves. The patient adducts the hip without rotation while the therapist palpates the adductor mass on the inner aspect of the proximal thigh. To begin the gravity-resisted test for hip external rotation, the patient is seated. The patient's hip is externally rotated. The patient holds this position while the therapist grasps the leg at the ankle and knee and attempts to internally rotate the hip.
Hold here. Don't let me turn your leg out. And relax.
The gravity-minimized test is conducted supine. The test limb is internally rotated. The patient attempts to externally rotate the hip while the clinician ensures that the pelvis remains neutrally aligned on the support surface. The external rotator muscles, except for the gluteus maximus, are not palpable.
Try to roll your leg out and relax.
The gravity-resisted test for hip internal rotation begins with the patient seated. The patient's hip is fully internally rotated. The patient holds this position while the therapist grasps the leg at the ankle and knee and attempts to externally rotate the hip.
And don't let me turn your leg in. Hold it. And relax.
The gravity-minimized test is conducted supine. The test limb is externally rotated. The patient attempts to internally rotate the hip. Gluteus medius can be palpated proximal to the greater trochanter. Tensor fasciae lati is palpated over the anterolateral hip, below the ASIS.
Roll your leg in toward the other. And relax.
There are 3 basic hamstring muscle tests for grades 5 and 4. The examiner should test first for the aggregate of the 3 hamstring muscles, with the foot in midline. The aggregate gravity-resisted test for hamstrings begins prone, with the limbs straight and the toes hanging over the edge of the table. The patient flexes the knee to approximately 90 degrees while maintaining the leg in neutral rotation. Outward resistance is applied just above the ankle.
Bend your knee, hold it, don't let me straighten it. And relax.
To begin the gravity-resisted test for the medial hamstrings, the knee is flexed to less than 90 degrees and the leg is internally rotated. The patient maintains the leg in flexion and internal rotation against the resistance of the clinician.
Bend your knee. Hold it. Don't let me straighten it. And relax.
To begin the gravity-resisted test for the lateral hamstrings, the knee is flexed to less than 90 degrees and the leg is externally rotated. The patient maintains the leg in flexion and external rotation against the resistance of the clinician.
Bend your knee. Hold it. Don't let me straighten it. And relax.
The Grade 2 test of the hamstrings is performed side-lying with the test limb uppermost and supported by the therapist. The patient flexes the knee through their available range of motion. The hamstring muscle test for grades 1 and 0 is performed prone, with the knee partially flexed and supported at the ankle by the therapist. The patient attempts to flex the knee while the therapist palpates both the medial and lateral hamstring tendons just above the posterior knee.
Try to bend your knee. And relax. Try to bend your knee. Relax. Try to bend your knee.